Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Today I'm speaking with Cheri Aimee. Her story is amazing, but even more amazing is her perspective and advice on developing individual awareness to bring our body and soul into alignment. What qualifies her to do this? Well, in addition to being an incredibly bright and accomplished woman who founded her own tech firm, Cheri had a near-death experience that shattered her world and forced her onto her own journey of the soul. This is a conversation you can't afford to miss. Cheri, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, give our viewers or our listeners a little bit of background on you.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Yes, so I have a very profound story where I died in 2010. I suffered from chemotherapy-induced myocarditis, and so I experienced cardiac arrest where my heart physically stopped beating. And doctors were unable to resuscitate me for over 90 minutes. It was actually a lot longer, but for the sake of really digesting my story, I share for the most part, I was dead for 90 minutes. I had to be transferred to a secondary hospital from my home state down into New York City, where they performed open heart surgery on me for 14 to 16 hours, something like that. A very obscene amount of hours for open heart surgery. And it turns out they could not figure out what happened to my heart, why it stopped. They could not even get it to continue beating still. Okay, so this is hours later. And ultimately, I ended up spending 4 months in the hospital fighting for my life with a less than 1% chance of survival, and basically becoming one of their pioneer patients for extended life support, which involved various different machines from a ventilator to actual bionic heart and lung system to keep me alive. And it was during this time that I had a incredible near-death experience where I actually crossed over into, I call the after realm. Some people call it the afterlife. Some people may refer to it as heaven. From my perspective, I really do like to call it the after realm, meaning another realm from this physical reality that, you and I are basically chatting in together now. And so it was not only a very deep health challenge for me that took me almost a decade to continue recovering from, but it was also the beginning of a very powerful spiritual awakening, almost an initiation into my own path of discovery of who I am and why I'm here. And so my whole essence and what I feel I am here to share with others is the journey of soul ascension, soul growth, spiritual awakening. And what is that journey? What is that path? And why are we actually on it? And so ultimately, this helps us to answer this question of things like, why do we get sick? Why is there so much suffering on the planet? And is there something that we can do to elevate ourselves and rise above the suffering, which is a form of ascension, right? And so it's taken me years to really unravel my own story. So a lot of people have heard me share around the world, some of the highlights of, oh, she died. Did she see the light? Who did she see? Did she see loved ones? Right. But I'm still on this ongoing inner quest. And that is my desire, is to really help others understand that I'm not just sharing a story, like this tragic story of how I, rose above it all. And all of a sudden I'm now living the most perfect life. That's not what it's about. And I know oftentimes it can get misunderstood as a story like that. But really what it is, sharing this story so that you can actually witness your own path throughout life and understand where you actually are along the journey and why you're on that journey in the first place. So it's an exciting topic. I love teaching. I love sharing. I love creating sacred circles where all of us just get to come together and talk about what matters most on the planet. So thank you, Pat, for having me here. And it's exciting to share some of the wisdom I've learned along my journey.
Oh, I think you have so much wisdom. One of the questions I have to help help people put this in perspective for their own lives is, how would you compare your spiritual awareness before and after this event?
Wow. It's night and day. So I would say, well, first let me share that I was a very, what is the word? I was a naturally intuitive child. I was very aware that there were missing aspects to the story of life. I was very aware that there had to be more than just the physical reality that we saw. And it's so interesting now to know that I had that level of awareness even when I was younger. And to be honest, many of us do have that awareness, but it's conditioned out of us, right? Through growing up with parents, moving through the school system, we're really conditioned to put those extra sensory perceptions to the back burner and to focus more on survival. So, so I always had this ability to recognize that there was more to life. And what that meant was that it was always at the back of my mind, even as I grew up into adulthood. So even as I got into, graduated college, worked for some of the top corporations in the world, eventually became a programmer and ended up in technology, that part of me was always still in the background of my mind. I was always aware of something else going on in the world, but I knew only to talk about it with certain people. So it wasn't my business. It wasn't my company. I was in very male dominated industries. So you kind of get this sense of, I'm aware of this whole other spiritual realm, yet I'm living in a very masculine dominated, materialistic, 3D oriented reality. And what that does is it creates like almost a split in your essence, because you're living one way and yet something inside you, your spirit, your soul, is always aware that there is something more vast out there. And so what that does is it kind of splits your focus, right?
And it's very interesting that you say that. I've had similar experiences where, particularly when I was flying, I used to fly high performance sailplanes, and it was a very male sport.
Mm-hmm.
I was the only woman on the field with a high performance plane. And the guys would come back after flying and they would talk about all their engineering stats about what they did. And I'd come back, I'd be like, wow, this is great. It's so beautiful. And it's not strictly a male female dichotomy. It's a little more left brain, right brain, I think. But there, our society as a whole relies on all these external, tangible markers as if they're real.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so well said. And then that becomes literally your whole way of living, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so it is a very, on a soul level, like when we get into really the depth of talking about who we are and why we are here, on that soul level, you are splitting who you are. And so it becomes like this fracture that occurs at a very young age. That at the beginning ages when we start to be conditioned to operate in this so-called quote unquote real world. And so when, to answer your question about, what was my level of awareness? Who was I prior to this near-death experience, this massive spiritual awakening? I was someone that was always aware, but I didn't have words to it, number one. I didn't often talk about it unless maybe to some of my closest best friends that had experienced something similar, right? So we always had that stuff to talk about together. But there was still this big unknown, right? Something still didn't make sense. And when stuff doesn't make sense like that, and it's a big part of who you are on the inside, it leaves a big gap, like a big gap in your essence, in who you are. And it becomes this like longing of the heart, that you keep suppressing so that you can continue to like fit in with the world and be like the good, obedient, human being, right? And so, getting those physical markers like you talked about. So after my near-death experience, I had just experienced my entire conditioned belief system, the framework, the architecture, the structure of my conscious mind was blown wide open and shattered. So coming out on the other side of this near-death experience, I felt that what I experienced crossing over was more real than this physical world. And I did not know what that meant. All I could tell you was that this world felt like the illusion. And when I crossed over, that world felt like the truth.
That had to be an amazing, for lack of a better word, identity crisis.
Yes, that's exactly what it was. And I will tell you, for about the first year, I did not talk very much. Number one, I was in complete shock. Okay. Because not only did I just go through this spiritual shattering of my ego, of my belief system, of what I knew to be true, now I'm also recovering on the back end of 4 months on life support. I'm in end-stage heart failure, living on mechanical heart devices, an actual life support device. So I was still living on that now for 5 years out of the hospital. Okay. So I'm living like a world that does not make sense because I cannot deny that I am physically attached to a long-term life support device. Yet my conscious awareness knows or is now awakened to that this, whatever's happening to me and in front of me, is an illusion.
Man, the sense of being dependent on medicine and a machine like that, and yet having this magnificent, flowing spiritual experience,
Yeah.
has got to be. I can't imagine how hard that was to try to reconcile the two, or do you?
It was very difficult. So like I said, that first year, I did not talk. Part of that was recovering from being on a ventilator for so long. You know, it weakens your lungs. So it's not like all those fancy schmancy hospital shows on television where these people literally wake up from like a coma of like years and they get up the next day, they're going home. Like it is not like that. So number one, again, that's a conditioning. We actually think, I will tell you this, being in a coma and finally waking up, I seriously was like, I can go home now. And they were like, no. I'm like, you know, like, can't you just take me off this life support? No. So yeah, I was experiencing, you know, there's not a lot of words for that level of shock of reality, but what you can kind of relate it to is what's really happening in humanity right now, right? So like a lot of us are just like, whoa, like it almost feels like the world shifted overnight in 2020 and just was like flipped upside down. And so there's a level of, if you really sit down and peace and quiet, you know, and actually acknowledge what is happening in the world, you will feel a sense of like, what in the world is going on right now? And that is really what it was like for me. I remember constantly repeating the phrase, now what? Now what? And I was saying that because I knew this wasn't real. And it was almost like this burden to have been shown this truth of our existence. And like somebody was playing a joke on me to send me back here with that truth.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life. You can subscribe to our free podcast at www.bumpintheroad.us or become a premium member to hear the full conversation. Just go to www.bumpintheroad.us for more information and to sign up.